The ocean is filled with strange alien-like creatures that are unique in their own way. However, the jellyfish family is perhaps the weirdest of them all. There are also many different species of jellyfish to draw inspiration from, making it a visually rich subject. Jellyfish also have a very foreign physiology with an appearance that is almost stranger than fiction in some sense. These creatures are very specific in their physiology and have no humanoid type of structure that we might be familiar with in other land animals such as bears, pandas, monkeys, or anything with arms and legs, which makes it a really interesting and fun drawing exercise. So with that being said, hey guys, my name is Matt. Welcome to another unique drawing tutorial by artincontext.org, where we explore various art related topics, and in today's video we will be breaking down the process of how to draw a jellyfish. Now this tutorial is done with a digital device, however all drawing processes can be transferred to traditional materials as long as you can kind of work with materials where you can layer colors. Now once again, there are various species of jellyfish to draw inspiration from, but we will be creating the classic Chrysaora jellyfish drawing, where we basically work with the more iconic features of the jellyfish with these long tentacles, these long arms, including the stomach, the bell-shaped top feature, also known as the bell or the bell margin, and slowly kind of working with these more iconic features of a jellyfish. But again, jellyfish are very abstract in physiology and aesthetics, so there's a lot of play and freedom to kind of have a more expressive representation of these various features. So with that being said, the way in which we're going to start this tutorial is just by a simple sketch where we start to shape the jellyfish. Now we want to start by simply establishing the general shape of the jellyfish in a really simple way to capture the proportions of the features. We want to start working on the general length of the tentacles and arms of the jellyfish at this point. We can also make sure that they are significantly larger than the bell structure of the jellyfish, and we can continue by basically thinking about how the bowl-like shape or the bell-like shape of that bell hood and how the tentacles flow out from the structure kind of differ in terms of scale, but also how those tentacles work in a type of unraveling ribbon shape. So you do want to think about ribbons when you think about the tentacles of a jellyfish and kind of how they twist as they move out from the bell structure. Now try to be very loose for now, just working out the flow and shape of the jellyfish drawing. And a good suggestion once again is to work with a reference image, because this can assist you in the drawing process just in terms of understanding these various features. Maybe consider looking at a diagrammatical drawing of the actual Chrysaora jellyfish. Now we're going to move on to refining the shape of the jellyfish. Once we have a general sketch of our jellyfish drawing, we can then lightly erase it, leaving behind some light ghost lines to assist us as we slowly refine the drawing with layered detail. Now as we proceed, we can start giving more structure and detailed features to the bell of the jellyfish, and this is where we can look at some examples of the Chrysaora jellyfish for some inspiration. This will just make the process of kind of shaping the jellyfish in its different features just a little easier for us. We also want to work with this unraveling concept, so we really want to keep that in mind as a main concept for these features, specifically the features that kind of come out from the bell structure, and that being the tentacles and the arms. To maintain that feature within the tentacles of the jellyfish is going to have a more realistic representation of the tentacles. We also want to make sure that we consider the arms of the jellyfish and how they flow around the tentacles in a spiraling motion. The arms of the jellyfish tend to be more noodle-like, whereas the tentacles tend to be slightly more flat and more ribbon-like. So again, just thinking about these general structures as we work with a reference image is going to make the process of representing these features more accurately much easier for us. Now once again, as we continue, we can lightly erase our sketch, again each time slowly bringing a slightly more refined shape to these various features, and this is where we can start thinking about adding in color details. In this case, we'll work with a spectrum of blues to maintain that aquatic appearance and translucent quality within our jellyfish drawing. The Chrysaora jellyfish often have a very white translucent quality, but they can vary in color depending on their origin of habitat. However, we will work with a variety of blues to capture an aquatic coloration. We want to start working in some blue details, again refine the shape of the various features, but to do so this time with color. And this is where we start to consider also the tonal variations that we want to work on. So depending on which areas are more exposed and less exposed to a light source, this will obviously have an effect on the tonal variations that we work with. We can also start to work on creating rides along the top surface area of the bell structure, and this will bring a slightly more nuanced quality to our jellyfish drawing, giving it a little bit more texture and shape. We can also work with a spectrum once again of blues to bring more definition in the various features. So this is where we want to actually work with building up our tonal variations from lighter colors to darker colors, and this will also give us more agency over our coloring process. Now as we continue and work our way through to the tentacles, we can start bringing a slightly more distinct shape to the jellyfish outline. Remember that we want to maintain that unraveling quality. It is really crucial for the tentacles, as this is the more unique and the more complicated structure within our jellyfish drawing. So kind of maintaining that unraveling quality of the tentacles as they flow from beneath the bell structure of the jellyfish. Now we also want to capture the tentacles in the center of the bell structure before adding the lace-like features around the jellyfish. So you do want to take your time with the shape of the tentacles. The arms will be added later as they will sit in the foreground and therefore on top of the tentacles, but also some of them will flow behind the jellyfish, which we can add in later, naturally creating that depth of field between the various features as they shift from the background into the foreground. But otherwise, now as we continue, we're going to finalize the general structure of the jellyfish. So once again, we can erase our jellyfish sketch one last time and then proceed to work in the base layer of a mid-tone blue into the entire jellyfish outline. Now as we do this, we'll see how it sets up the kind of base color on the entire jellyfish drawing within the confines of the jellyfish outline. Now this will set the foundational color, on top of which we will work in some darker blues to create some three-dimensionality in the various features and bring in more structure to our jellyfish drawing. Now we can start working on some light line work and shading, working our way from the bell structure through to the tentacles. Now this is where we really start to spend a good portion of time on each feature of the jellyfish, integrating some line work and shading as we slowly start to create a little bit more of a detailed sketch within these various features. When it comes to the tentacles, we really want to make sure we create a gradient within those twisting qualities to suggest an unraveling effect, and this is basically how we can kind of think about dimension in terms of shadow formation in the structure as it unravels and becomes more exposed to a light source. So you do want to think about how every time the tentacle twists, it has a moment of becoming more shaded, and therefore more shadow formation will form along the tentacle's surface area, and naturally this will have a gradient as it shifts and unravels once again and becomes more exposed to a light source. So when it comes to the tentacles, we really want to make sure we create those gradients within the twisting qualities to suggest that unraveling effect, while simultaneously this will also show more dimension in the structure as it unravels and becomes more exposed to the light source. As we do this, we can also then start working in these little circular structures to represent those suction cups within or along the edges of the ribbon-like structures of the tentacles. So try to work with darker blues at this point as you add in these unique details. Each time you kind of work through one section of the tentacle one at a time. Again, take your time with this. Each feature, specifically the tentacles, really does take some time in terms of representing all of these little details. It is quite a simple process, but it is something you do want to take your time with. So you want to work kind of from the top all the way through to the edges of each tentacle, slowly creating these gradients, adding in these darker blue details where you define the structures of these suction cups at the edges of the ribbon-like structure for each tentacle. We can then start to work on the lacy arm structures that kind of sit over the tentacles or in front of the tentacles to emphasize that depth of field between the tentacles in the background and then the lacy arm structures that flow within the foreground. Remember, the lacy arm structures, just in terms of jellyfish anatomy, does spiral around the bell structure, and naturally this means it will sit in front of the tentacles that are placed within the center of the jellyfish and kind of move its way towards the background behind the tentacles as well. We can then start to work on as well building up both the tentacles and arms with layers of blue, and this is where we really want to think about working with various blues to not only set up this foundational color, but then to start integrating darker blue details to create a little bit more dimension in these various details, and then slowly work in some lighter blues to emphasize some highlights. Do take your time with this, make sure you work with a reference image, but otherwise we're going to start integrating the final shadows and highlights. Once we have sketched and added color to the main aspect of the jellyfish, we can then enhance them with some darker line work, shading and highlights, and this is where we work strategically once again to darken the shadow areas while simultaneously adding in some highlights to the lighter areas. Now again, really consider the light source and the direction from which the light comes to have a more effective approach in terms of establishing shadows and highlights. Now again, we do want to work slow and strategically to darken the shadowed areas and simultaneously add in these highlights. highlights, but we can also start to add in some highlights to the details of the bell along the surface area of the bell in our jellyfish drawing, giving more structure to the final details such as the warts and ridges. Now, spending a good portion of time on the bell structure of the jellyfish, giving more structure to the final details such as the warts and the ridges, is really important, and this is where basically the warts will be protruding, so we can add more highlights to them as they become more exposed to a light source, whereas the ridges are more indentations and therefore have more shadow formations. You also want to take your time at this point, working your way through the entire jellyfish drawing, slowly bringing more shape with darker line work to the tentacles, arms and bell feature. Again, the jellyfish isn't necessarily something difficult to draw, but we do want to isolate these features and work on them one at a time, slowly building up these details. So spend a good portion of time on each of these details present within the foreground, and really think about that depth of field. Think about how the arms kind of wrap around the tentacle in a spiraling fashion, like spokes on a wheel. Naturally, this is going to create a distinction between these various depths of field and where you kind of place the arms in the foreground and how you color them. So maybe you can make the arms light in the foreground, the tentacles kind of darker as they sit behind the arms in the foreground. Now, once we have drawn in the main feature present in the foreground, we can also start to work in the shading and detail into the features placed in the background. And again, this is where we create that distinction by integrating shading and highlights to represent difference in terms of how close or how far a feature is within our drawing. Otherwise, guys, we can then take our time going through the whole drawing, slowly working in some darker shading and highlights, once again making sure we go through each feature once at a time. And this particular process is quite necessary for the area where the bowl-like structure of the bell kind of casts a shadow on the tentacles, where the tentacles basically originate from. And by developing more shading and shadow formation in that area where the bell actually casts a shadow onto the tentacles, we are basically defining a more realistic representation of how that feature covers the tentacles. But otherwise, once again, make sure to take your time going through the entire drawing, slowly working in some darker shading and highlights in these different features. This is particularly necessary for the area with that bowl-like structure. And then lastly, you can add a background to further emphasize the deepness of the ocean to contextualize your jellyfish drawing. It's not necessary, but it is just a further step that you can do if you would like. And there you have it, guys, how to draw a jellyfish through a few simple steps. Some key things to take away: establish the general shape of your jellyfish, really capture the main features and scale and proportions of the different features. From there, you can slowly start to refine the structure, integrate your colors, slowly build them up through some color details where you work with lighter tonal variations or values into darker tonal values, and then slowly refine it with some darker outlines, some darker details and some highlights. If you did like this video, please let us know in the comment section below if you're interested in creating similar drawings related to similar topics such as sea animals or just animals in general. We'd love to hear back from you guys, and you can show your support by liking and subscribing. This helps us to grow the channel, which enables us to make more art-related content for you guys, which we love to do. But that is it for today. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, cheers.